Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we're here for my LCK Semifinals overview and analysis. Incredibly excited to go over this series. In this video, we're getting really close to wrapping up the LCK playoffs, and I, for one, am incredibly excited to see where things go. In this series, we're going to see who's going to be facing off against T1 in the LCK finals, but honestly, just as importantly, we're going to be seeing which team is going to be moving on to MSI to accompany T1 to that major event. We're really getting to the point in the year where those MSI representatives are getting well known, and we're definitely going to be getting a good idea as to what kind of team we're going to be sending to MSI in this series. But of course, let me know down in the comment section below what you guys thought of this series. I really like the matchup between these two teams. If you want to know my full thoughts and preview on it, you can go ahead and check out my round 3 video that I posted a little bit earlier in the week. Obviously, in that one, I go over the round 3 matchups, of course, winners finals, as well as, that 3rd, 4th place match to get here. But at the end, I do preview this semifinals match, talk about where I think some of the advantages and disadvantages could lie for each team, and give my prediction, which, obviously we'll go over a bit here. But if you want a more detailed breakdown of that video is going to be up in the iCard, and you can check that out. But for now, let's go ahead and jump right into it. We've only got one series to cover in this one, and so I'm really excited to delve deep into it, starting, of course, by quickly looking at how these teams match up, and we're going to do that right now. We had a matchup between the number 2 seeded Gen.G and the number 3 seeded KT Rolster. A really, really interesting matchup. Arguably the most interesting matchup we could have gotten here in the playoffs on paper. This is a Gen.G team that is incredibly consistent, very slow, very methodical, very LCK. When you think of, the LCK Korean style over the past few years, you think of how Gen.G has been playing over the course of this year. Not exactly the most explosive early game team, but a team that really knows how to get it done in the mid to late game, has great macro, and really doesn't make all that many mistakes. They really do capitalize on what the enemy does wrong, and I think it's gotten them very far so far in the LCK. And then for KT Rolster on the other side, this is kind of the opposite, a super aggressive, very in-your-face, can be a little bit feast or famine oriented team, but the talent on this team is certainly undeniable. They have been so good as of late. They absolutely earned their spot here by beating Hanwha Life Esports, and Gen.G maybe not in the best of form, having just lost a series to T1, but losing to T1 is something that both of these teams have in common in the playoffs so far. So what did I think was going to happen between these two teams? Well, KT Rolster was actually able to take the season series 4-0. They didn't drop a single game to Gen.G in the regular season in 2023, which is actually massive. Very, very different from some of the other playoff series that we've mentioned, because KT is the lower seed, but matchup-wise, they actually seem relatively favorable into a team like Gen.G, but I kind of shocked a lot of people when I predicted Gen.G to be able to win this series. My spread was Gen.G 3-2. I thought that was going to be the most likely outcome. I thought these two teams were relatively even, and I thought a good series for KT Rolster could absolutely spell a victory, but a bad one and a really consistent one coming out from Gen.G, where they just play their style of game and get everything moving at their pace, could definitely spell victory for Gen.G. So I did think both sides had a really good chance here, but I do like both of these teams, and I think whichever one ends up coming out of this series, heading to MSI, heading to finals, is going to have absolutely deserved it. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into the game-by-game analysis, starting, of course, with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was KT Rolster. They are able to take the first game in this series and go up 1-0. Really, really big win coming out from them. Could be a very difficult situation that they actually find themselves in. Gen.G, obviously a team that's pretty notorious for being able to choke out the life of the opponents that they're able to face in the playoffs, but KT trying to generate a lot of pressure early. This is the time period where Gen.G hasn't necessarily been as active or as fruitful, and I think that definitely was the case in this one. They were able to get a lot of pressure just utilizing this ridiculously strong CC combo of Sion and Vi, and honestly, we'll talk about Keen for quite a bit, but he was phenomenal on this Sion this game. This champion has been a little bit hit or miss, I would say, over the course of the playoffs. If you look at regions like the LCS, it's been a pretty good pick. If you look at regions like the LPL, it's been a pretty horrible pick. And so I think it really does depend on the kind of playstyle that you're going to go for. I think the LCK is a little bit closer to the LCS than they are to the LPL. I think this more passive kind of scale to the late game style is going to be a little bit more impactful and effective here in the LCK. And I think Keem, while he's playing a champion like Sion, who does like to do that, was certainly active in the early game trying to make plays. He ends up picking up a solo kill in the top lane on Doran, which is absolutely massive in this, situation and matchup where the Jace really should just be able to generate a lot of leads on his own. A gold lead for KT Rolster. They finally break out in a fight at around 25 minutes to really extend their lead, and this is where things really become like unmanageable for Gen.G. Obviously some mishaps towards the back half of the game. Aiming, dying for absolutely no reason in the jungle. He's just kind of standing there while the rest of the team walks into him, and he just dies basically instantly when your AD carry throws away his life. It's never a particularly good sign, but Keen tries to go in to save him. He ends up dying too. KT basically doing everything they can in that split second to throw the game, but they were like 9k gold ahead. There was only so much they could throw at that point, and they eventually end up winning a team fight towards the Dragon, towards the back half of this game, right around, 30, 31 minutes, and they're able to close it out from there, which is super important. My player of the game is going to go to Keen in the top lane. I think he's honestly going to get a little bit underrated for how good his performance was. I'm glad the broadcast recognized him with player of the game, but he was definitely the standout member of KT Rolster, and quite frankly, he's been a massive influence in why this team has been playing so well in the playoffs so far. Honestly, it really does look like a top 2 in the top lane in the LCK right now. Zeus does seem like a little bit of a step above basically everybody else in the LCK, but Keen is right there with him. He's certainly someone that can go head-to-head with him. We saw that when they faced off in that second round matchup, but, putting him on something like Sion, you're kind of expecting him to, secede pressure, I would say, early on in the game to a player like Doran. Unfortunately, for Gen.G, Keen was just better, and he was able to pick up pressure, he was able to pick up solo kills, and he played off of his jungler really well. This is impressive stuff from Keen, but it's kind of what he's been showing all year long. The other player that I want to shout out here, BDD in the mid lane. He had another really good game, this time on the Ahri. He was able to create a lot, of course. Lissandra and Ahri is a relatively Lissandra-favored matchup, and so I also wasn't expecting a lot coming out from him, but he just outplayed basically everybody on the side of Gen.G. Those charms were absolutely on point. His aggressiveness was really high, and they were creating a lot of up and down scenarios that I think mostly benefited KT Rolster. I think the wackier and wilder a lot of these games get, the more it's going to end up benefiting a team like KT that likes to play in this fringe zone where they can be a little bit aggressive. Maybe they can make a few mechanical mistakes, but they're going to come out on top anyways because they're the most experienced with kind of playing this more back and forth style, and I think that was absolutely the case here. Cuz had a good game. Lahens had a good game. Aiming did his absolute best to throw this game away towards the back half, but he was good outside of what was just a single miserable play towards the back half that in almost any other situation would have lost them the game, but, they were able to survive it, and that's all that really, really matters at the end. KT is able to pick up a win and start the series off with a bang. As for Gen.G, certainly not how you wanted to start the series. Going 0-1 to start isn't exactly surprising. Again, this team couldn't take a game off of KT in the regular season, and that version of Gen.G absolutely showed up in this game. My dud of the game is going to go to Doran in the top lane. I've always been a little bit lower on Doran, but to see him get completely outclassed by Keen in this game is just not a good sign, especially on a matchup that, quite frankly, he just should be able to win in the Jace into Sion. It's not like the rest of the team was helping him out. Pays was pretty bad in teamfights. Delight really didn't accomplish all that much on the Tahm Kench. He was able to save, Chovy and Doran a couple of times, but it really didn't amount to actually winning team fights, and then Chovy just really couldn't do all that much on the Lissandra. Peanut was probably the most active player on the side of Gen.G, but even then, Viego resets were really the only thing that this team had going for them towards the back half of the game. They had no macro, they really were just reliant on KT making mistakes, and outside of the major one that KT made, they didn't make any sort of minor ones that allowed them to kind of claw their way back. It ended up just being a Gen.G team that was unable to hit the team fighting phase that they are oh so good at with any relative normalcy in this game. So, unfortunate from Gen.G, but there's definitely more games in the series to kind of move along and get over because it's only 1-0. You can fight your way back here, and you certainly do not want to go down 2-0 to a team like KT Rolster, who it's going to be nearly impossible to win 3 straight games against. But for KT, this could be an awesome opportunity to really establish control of this series and to prove that your series earlier on in the playoffs against T1, where you really took them to the limit, was not a fluke and truly was one of the more interesting teams. They truly are one of the more interesting teams in the entire world. We're going to find out which one of those is going to be true as we move in now to game number 2. And the winner of game number 2 was Gen.G, they are able to take game number 2 in this series, and they're able to even things up at 1 apiece. Very important win from them again. You really couldn't afford to go down in this series 0-2. Winning 3 games in a row against KT Rolster is certainly not a task that I would wish upon anyone, or especially forcibly, and especially after KT had been starting to generate some momentum, being able to win some games in a row. But Gen.G finally are able to pick up their first win of the year against this KT Rolster team, and they look pretty good doing it. This is just a very different look than anything they were giving in game number 1. KT really had control of that from the early portion because of the top side of the map, and I would honestly argue that a very similar thing was happening for Gen.G in this game. Now, a lot of interesting points. I think that there were some back and forth moments for Gen.G in the early game, but for the most part, this entire game kind of revolved around what they were doing and what they kind of wanted to do in this. So let's go ahead and talk about it. A couple of really big early plays involving Pays in the bot lane here for Gen.G. The first one being him just being way overextended, Chovy not roaming down quick enough, and KT Rolster just having a ton of prio to be able to take him out for first blood. And then the second, after they had moved to the top lane, it's Pays actually doing everything he can to try and save his support Delight here, basically melee ranging the Aphelios, and actually succeeding, just being able to completely pop off with this champion because nobody is really able to take his damage at this point in the game. And so, just generally really good stuff coming out from the Gen.G bot lane. Are not exactly the most consistent, but, you know, I would rather take the positives and the negatives than have nothing coming out from that slot. I think that it was overall a net positive for them, especially with Delight getting ahead as well. But then we start to get into the mid to late game. We start getting into, you know, some of these kind of interesting team fights. There's a really fun second dragon fight where Aiming actually goes nuts. He's able to really pop off a great Feather Storm coming out from him on the Xayah. He was really good this game, which we'll talk about in a bit, but Chovy is able to clean it up. Chovy and Peanut, I guess, are both able to clean up kind of the remnants in the back of the pit towards the back of the fight. It ends up just being a basic 3-for-3, and, you know, both of these teams are incredibly even up until we finally get to our 4th dragon a game, the 3rd dragon here for Gen.G, and that's where the big fight really happens, and Gen.G finally is able to take a win. Peanut plays phenomenal in that fight, and I want to give a ton of credit to Chovy as well for having a really good game on the Ahri, but Gen.G just continuously find pick after pick after pick in the mid to late game, and eventually just are able to close it out with a really nice win. They had basically full control of this game. I think draft had a lot to do with it. I don't like the draft of KT Rolster, which we'll get into in a bit, but I really do like what Gen.G, I should say, was able to do in this game. Player of the game for me is easily going to go to Peanut in the jungle. He was probably their best player in game number 1, and he certainly was their best player in game number 2. When Peanut is on, when he's on some of the best champions in the entire world that he can play, he is just unstoppable. His pathing is excellent, his ability to skirmish is really, really good, and his synergy with the rest of this team is incredibly solid, especially with this mid laner Chovy, which we saw towards the back half of this game a lot. I know a lot of people give both of these players credit, or flack, I should say, for not exactly, you know, playing the best with their teammates, but I would argue that these two have a very good synergy together as teammates, even if it doesn't necessarily translate into some of the other lanes all of the time. But Peanut was awesome on the Wukong, and really there's not a lot of negatives to add. His engages were great, his damage was staggering towards the back half of the game, just a lot of positives. And then, like I said, Chovy was also super active in this game. It's really fun to see him on a champion where he can zip and zap and dash around all over the place to try and generate his own leads. He was able to do that in this game. The charms were landing, the Qs were landing. That's the second game in a row that we've seen a really strong Ahri come out for the side of one of the two teams, you know, the winning team in that case, and, you know, really important stuff. Again, I talked about how Pays and Delight were pretty solid in the bot lane in the early game, not necessarily making as big of a difference in the late game, but still, you know, it's good to know that you're going to have players that are willing to step up and be aggressive when it matters the most. Aggression has never really been a problem when it came to Pays, and I thought Delight had a good game on the Tahm Kench, but overall, just a solid one for Gen.G, and certainly a win that they desperately needed. As for KT Rolster on the other side, unfortunate not to go up in this series 2-0. I think you really would have liked to do that, but it's just not going to be in the cards here. My dud of the game is actually going to go to Keen in the top lane. I know a lot of people are going to give it to BDD, or they're going to give it to Cuz, but I think the Malphite was probably the most useless member on the side of KT Rolster in this game number 2. You R5 it, you want to bring that into Ornn, and really when you have something like a Twisted Fate in the mid lane, you're really looking at the rest of your team for that damage source, because TF in general, while he's great as a CC bot, moving around the map, creating opportunities, he's just not really going to be dealing out all that much damage in the current form that he is in. So you're relying on Aiming, and you're relying on Keen to be able to generate early leads in the game, and he just wasn't able to do that on a pick like Malphite. I don't really understand the decision to go for this here. I think it, you know, was really kind of centered around the fact that Wukong and Aphelios are just not all that good into Malphite, but I don't think you really have a ton of synergy between Malphite and maybe the rest of the members of the team, and I do think that caused a bit of friction in this game. Because in BDD were also bad, they certainly got outclassed by their respective laners in this game, and I kind of talked about that already. Peanut and Chovy were awesome. Cuz and BDD were not so awesome. It's gonna happen every once in a while. I still like these two as players, but game 2 wasn't exactly their strength. I would say aiming at a much better game here. He's honestly been the weak link of KT Rolster throughout the playoffs so far, so it's really good to see him have a game where even when the rest of the team is kind of crumbling around him, he's actually team fighting really well. Xayah's one of those champions that, as long as you don't just, randomly walk into a bush and try to throw the lead that your team has been able to generate in a game number 1, as long as you don't do that, you're probably going to be in a position to actually affect a lot of these team fights. And, he was pretty close to being able to bring the game back in the mid game, unfortunately. It just was not going to be enough. But for KT Rolster, now the series is tied at 1-1, and this kind of goes for both of these teams. Generating momentum and generating, confidence, I should say, in this series is a big deal. Being able to win this game 3, go up 2-1, and kind of establish yourself in a dominant position, only needing to win one of the last 2 games is a really good spot to be in for either of these teams. But which one is going to achieve it? Well, we're going to find out now as we move on to game number 3, and the winner of game number 3 was Gen.G. They are able to take game number 3, and they're able to take a lead in this series, going up 2-1, putting this on series point and on KT's life point. They have no more mistakes that they can make. This game has eliminated all, second chances that this team is going to be getting over the course of the 2023 spring split. But really good game coming out from Gen.G. This was another very controlled performance. I think a lot of people are pointing the finger at KT rather than raising the hand of Gen.G. And obviously, you know how I feel about that. One of my big goals of the channel has always been to prop up players and prop up teams rather than, drag down players and drag down teams. Yes, some players can have bad games every once in a while, but let's be honest, this is the top 3 teams in the LCK. All 10 of these players are very, 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 very good at what they do, and they can have a bad game every once in a while. But for Gen.G to be able to come out and capitalize on that, for some of the mechanical plays to come out from Gen.G in this game, it's just really impressive stuff, and I want to talk about that a little bit more than I want to talk about how maybe some of the members of KT Rolster didn't necessarily have any phenomenal performances. Let's go ahead and start it off. Early on in the game, there really wasn't a lot of action. We didn't actually get anything major until about 7 minutes, where Lehens gets caught out on a Gen.G invade. This is a really good timing coming out from Peanut. He knows he's going to be able to play super aggressive because Chovy has the push in the mid lane, and Doran has the push at the time in the top lane, and so he's able to basically freely walk in, and he finds that Karma. He finds the ability to kind of just jump on her, and First Blood's really, really easy. It takes a little while to get into it, but, eventually Gen.G does generate a nice little lead. They do take some strong trades in the early game, Gen.G that is, but they do give over the Drakes to KT, and that's how KT is going to be staying in this game. Gold was relatively even through the early game, and a lot of that was because while Gen.G was taking fights and while they were getting pressure, KT was getting a lot of the objectives in the game. And while Gen.G was probably happy to give those over because they knew that if they got the gold and if they started funneling, the right resources, that they were going to be able to take the objectives later when they mattered more, it's certainly a risky proposition to give KT a lot of free stats, basically like they did a lot of this game. And honestly, it kind of came back to bite them a bit. Third Dragon came around and KT actually wins a massive fight. Aiming plays out of his mind in that fight on the Ezreal, does about 6,000 damage in that one fight on his own. I mean, just absolutely ludicrous. BDD is playing well. I thought Cuz and Keen were doing a good job in that fight, and KT has taken a pretty solid lead. It's only about 2k, but they have a lot of pressure on the map, and they've definitely started stacking objectives, which is going to be a major problem for Gen.G if they don't quell it soon. Luckily for Gen.G fans, they are able to get a breath of respite in the top lane, as Chovy ends up getting 4-manned in the top lane, and he's Cassante. This is not going to work out. He ends up just moving around. He gets a Lantern coming out from Thresh. The rest of his team arrives, and this ends up turning into a 3 and a 4 for 0 on the side of Gen.G, which is just massive. This completely takes any lead that KT Rolster had in the game and completely evaporates it. Not only are they able to get all of those kills, not only are they able to pick up a ridiculous amount of gold, but they're able to get the Baron as well, which is unreal. A very, very good play coming out from Gen.G that takes any sort of semblance of a lead that KT has and completely flips it on his head and brings it right back into the favor of Gen.G, and they would just never relinquish it. KT can't win fights towards the back half of the game. Paze was actually team fighting really well. We'll get to my player of the game in a second, but Gen.G macro was also really good basically from this point onwards. They weren't over-forcing things. They knew exactly when they needed to go in and when they could play aggressive and when they could end the game, and honestly, just really good stuff coming out from Gen.G. Player of the game for me is going to go to Delight, the support coming out on the Thresh here for Gen.G. A real Thresh game coming out from Delight. I know I've been a little bit lower on him as a player, but this is one of those upside games that I just didn't know Delight had in him. I knew he was talented, and I knew he had the ability to kind of pop off in a way that maybe some of the other supports in the LCK didn't have the ability to, but this was like a super top tier mechanical Thresh performance. Like, I was, nameplates off, you could have convinced me this was Keria. It really was that good coming out from him. He was a really easy choice for player of the game. I did not have to think about that really at all. That fight that ended up turning the game in the top side where Chovy looked like he got caught out, a lot of that was turned because Delight just could not miss a hook, even if he wanted to. He landed a super important one on aiming, and then another one onto Lehens, and then another one onto BDD, and they were able to just pile up these kills over and over and over again. I want to give a shout out to Pays as well, because he was the one kind of following up. I would say on a lot of what this Thresh was doing, the bot lane was much better in this game. This was probably their best game of the series so far, and that's a good sign for Gen.G. You wanted to see your young players start to level up as these games got a little bit more familiar and a little bit more comfortable with them, and I think that's definitely been the case. Chovy was a monster on Cassante. You really can't give him this champion. Peanut had some good early games, and I thought Doran was pretty good in the top lane on the Gnar. Overall, Gen.G was just solid. Really not a lot of complaints, not a lot of negatives coming out from this team. Yes, the early game wasn't exactly perfect, and that fight around Third Dragon definitely could have been better, but at the end of the day, you were able to pull it out, capitalizing on some KT mistakes, and kind of playing a very Gen.G game, if you will. As for KT on the other side, this is a very KT game. If the other side's going to be playing their style, I guess you have to as well. They were able to generate a strong lead in the early game because they are just mechanically incredibly good. Aiming and Lehens, in particular, were really strong. Like I said, 6k damage coming out from aiming in that fight at the Third Dragon. That's the reason he's not getting done of the game, but getting hooked by the Thresh in that top lane fight where he's just pushing way too far forward, that is a game-losing play, and that is one of the, I think you can make a real argument that's the second game-losing play that he has made in this series so far. Game 1, they ended up being able to win anyways, but this was a really, really bad one on the Ezreal in Game 3. My dud of the game, though, is going to go to Lehens, because as bad as aiming was, he also had some fantastic moments, and really they wouldn't have been in nearly as good of a spot at that point in the game without aiming there in the first place, and so I'm going to give dud of the game to Lehens, who really didn't feel like he accomplished almost anything this game. He was caught out in his own jungle early on because he had no vision, and then in these team fights, he was basically a hook magnet for this Thresh. The support diff in this game was absolutely massive, and you could tell that in a lot of the late game team fights. There really was not a lot coming out from this Karma. Ezreal Karma, not a lane that we're really seeing all that much around the world right now, and a lot of that is just because, if you don't get that super big lead in the early game, there's just not a lot of pressure coming out from them in the mid to late game, and I think that was a really, really big problem for KT Rolster, but everybody else on the team was honestly fine. BDD certainly had his bad moments. Thought he was overextended at points, and this was a little bit closer to that game number 2 than it was to his game number 1, but it wasn't like the worst performance of all time, and I actually think Keen and Cuz were relatively fine in their respective roles. It was just this bot lane that I think really couldn't handle the pressure, and, we're a little bit too eager, I think, to make some plays, which has kind of been a theme and a trend with this KT Rolster team. They are very fun, they are very active, but sometimes that can cost them looking for plays in situations where they just shouldn't be, especially the players that ended up looking for them. And so, yes, I do think KT Rolster is a good team, but they got to prove it now because they are one game away from being eliminated here in third place, and for Gen.G to move on to the LCK Finals and to MSI. But, obviously Gen.G's got to be able to take care of business. If KT Rolster comes out and wins this game 4, we could be moving to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, and I'm incredibly excited if that is the possibility. So who's going to win? Is Gen.G going to close out the series, or is KT Rolster going to keep it alive? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Gen.G. They are able to take game number 4, and they're able to close out this series with a 3-1 series win to move on not only to the LCK Finals, but to MSI, officially for the first time in organization history. That sounds like it should be wrong. Gen.G at some point should have been able to make MSI, maybe even a Samsung Galaxy before the rebrand, or KSV, or any version of this team, but no, this is the first time anyone not named T1 or Damn1 will be playing at MSI. And obviously T1 will also be there, but you know, this is the first time that an LCK rep not named one of those two will be there, and that is absolutely massive for this Gen.G team. A lot of these players that absolutely deserve their chance to prove how good they are on an international stage are going to get their chance, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm getting ahead of talking about how this series ended up going and how this Game 4 ended up going because I'm already jumping to the end of the story. Well, Gen.G was able to take it, and this was probably the most dominant game of the series here. It was a really good closeout, a really strong win from a Gen.G team that I think you really wanted to see it from. A level 1 kill on Lehens in the bot lane. He just got way too aggro going in for a trade here, and it basically doomed the bot lane instantly. The Pays and Delight are really good, and you can't give them the opportunity to go super aggro on you this early on in the game. Lehens does that on the Nautilus and ends up paying for it, giving over that first blood, and then really we start to get this big fantastic like macro showcase from Gen.G, and I've been talking about it a bit in the previous games, especially 2 and 3, where Gen.G's macro is just simply better than KT's, and it's by a large enough margin for me to write it down in my notes every single game, but this is the game where it really, like, showed, where you have Chovy in the mid lane on this Lissandra, and you've got BDD in the mid lane on this Twisted Fate. Which one do you think is going to be roaming to lanes and actively impacting a global scale a bit more? Well, if you guessed the Lissandra, well, you would have been correct. And how did you guess that? Obviously, you knew I was setting you up for a trick question. It almost feels like you're cheating at this point. But yeah, Chovy was freaking awesome in this game on the Lissandra. He was top lane over and over and over again, and he destroyed Keen's game on this Jax. He never really was able to get off the ground. Really good timings coming out and timers coming out from Chovy, knowing exactly when Cuz was not going to be in the area so that he could safely go top lane and go for that 2v1 play, basically under tower twice, and both times it ends up working. One time Chovy gets a kill, the other time Doran gets a kill, and now both of the solo lanes are ahead. Now both of the members in the bot lane are ahead as well, and Peanut's doing a pretty good job. While, you know, Cuz is actually having a pretty good game here in game number 4, Peanut is certainly not slacking off, and he's definitely doing a good job making sure to keep objectives as a major priority for Gen.G, something that they really weren't doing towards the beginning part of the series, especially obviously in game number 3. But, you know, credit to Chovy, credit to Doran, credit to Pays. They were all really able to generate a lot of leads in the early game, and then eventually we get this massive fight around Dragon Soul for Gen.G that very much goes in favor of Gen.G. Even with Cuz playing really well, he's able to pull back 1 or 2 basically on his own on this Vi because he really is far ahead, and he's doing a really good job at being able to kind of, you know, expedite that lead. Unfortunately, it's just not enough to overcome what is the entirety of this Gen.G team. Chovy's playing great, Peanut's playing great, Doran, Pays, Delight, all 5 members were playing at a super high level in this game, and, you know, honestly, it just wasn't all that fair. Their macro was so much better. Their mechanics were there, and Gen.G was able to win eventually with a nice engage in the bot lane near the inhibitor to close out the series and to, you know, bring us to a pretty familiar finals experience, a T1 versus Gen.G matchup. We'll obviously talk about that in a second, but let's talk about Gen.G in this series. My player of the game in game number 4 is going to go to Chovy. He was really solid on the Lissandra, again, being able to kind of dominate his lane enough to be able to shove and roam top lane over and kind of dominate top lane in that same way as well. It's very rare that you have a mid laner win 2 lanes for you, but it felt like Chovy did that in this game. Not to take away from Doran, because Doran was really good in this one, and obviously his outplay of a potential 1v4 in the top lane that kind of created an opportunity for Gen.G to really move back into the game with their pressure was a big deal, but it just, you know, him and Chovy as a duo were really what kind of stood out to me, and so Chovy is going to go ahead and get that player of the game even if Doran was close. Pays and Delight were also phenomenal. Basically from level 1, they were the better bot lane, and they were the better bot lane this entire series as well. All 4 games, really, I think you could say that Pays and Delight were awesome. And the Xayah Rakan definitely fits these two. They can play the Aphelios, they can play the Xayah, they can play the Zeri. Basically whatever you want. Whatever's meta right now, I'm not really worried about this bot lane being able to pull it out at a high level. Even the enchanters, Delight has shown that he has been able to pull them out, even if he does favor some of these more engage-oriented champs, some of these more playmake-oriented champs like the Rakan here. And then Peanut was just really good across this series. He was a little bit less impactful in this game directly in terms of like a lot of the standout plays, but obviously the objective control is absolutely massive, and it really allowed them to end this game a lot quicker than I think a lot of other people would have expected it to be. They're moving on to finals now. Obviously a very interesting series. We'll talk about it in a second, but let's talk about KT KT Rolster, because their split has officially come to an end here at the hands of Gen.G. This was a really, really good split. I know KT fans don't want to hear that because they don't want to be out here in third and not in second, but man, this was a team that I had in fifth in my preseason power rankings. I was worried that potentially they could be sixth, or they could be like a bottom, potential for 4 team if everything like did not click. I was worried about the team synergy. I was worried about the cohesion, but all of that went out the window. BDD had an MVP level season after coming off the worst year of his career. Cuz leveled up his control and his consistency a ridiculous amount. Keen is one of the best top laners in the world, and Aiming and Lehens worked better as a duo than I ever could have thought, considering their playstyles and how those two meshed together. Honestly, everything that could have gone right for KT Rolster, the split kind of went right, and there's a lot to build on. I know it's unfortunate that you lost this game number 4. Dead of the game's going to go to Keen. I think you could give it to Lehens. I think you could give it to BDD. Basically anybody who isn't Cuz in this game number 4, but more so than this game 4 and more so than this series, I think there is a lot to like about KT Rolster just because they're not going to be one of the 2 teams out of the LCK to be heading to MSI in the spring here. That does not mean they are not one of the more dangerous and interesting teams in the entire world. They've got an entire half of a year to figure out what they want to do, try to get a little bit more consistent, and then perhaps we could be seeing this team in the finals next to a team like T1 later on in the year. But for Gen.G on the other side, they're going to be facing off now against T1 in the finals. I didn't say my player of the series. My player of the series overall is actually going to go to Peanut in the jungle. He was that against Hanwha Life in their win early on in the playoffs. He's going to get that here against KT Rolster as well. He's been really good for this team in the playoff run. He's not going to get the credit that he deserves because Peanut, quite frankly, never gets the credit that he deserves online, but he's been fantastic, and he's going to be my player of the series here. And they're going to need him because they're going up against T1, and man, that series is always interesting. I really do like how these two end up interacting, but for Gen.G, they're going to need to channel all of the good vibes and the goodwill that they were able to bring out in this series because they're going to need it against a team like T1. Alright, that is going to do it for my LCK semifinals overview and analysis of the 4 games that we got there. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you're looking for like a preview of the finals or a matchup, kind of key matchup series like I usually do at the end of these videos, well, you're in luck. I actually have already done one on T1 versus Gen.G. I did it for their upper bracket matchup, and quite frankly, not a lot has changed. I actually feel very similarly to how I did in that part of the series, and so you can go ahead and check out that section at the end of my round 2 video if you are curious about what I feel about these matchups and these previews. But long story short, T1 should be the better team basically across the board. They were so talented in every single role. I found it really hard to kind of bet against them in almost any situation. Gen.G is playing well right now, but T1 is just on a different level. This is very likely the single best team in the entire world at the moment, and I just don't see them being knocked off all that easily. My prediction is going to be T1 3-0. T1 3-1 is my 2-game spread. T1 should be the better team, and they should be able to get it done in the finals to be sending themselves to MSI as the number 1 seeds in the LCK. But, of course, let me know what you guys think of that series down in the comments section below. Do you think that it's going to go in the way of T1, or do you think Gen.G has the opportunity for a massive upset here in the finals? Of course, I like to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot to me. Not only does it let me know that you guys are enjoying the video, but it helps get this video out to more people as well, which of course is very appreciated. Of course, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. I don't only post LCK content on this channel. We post for all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL. And so if you're interested in any of that, hit that sub button. We're posting 33 days in a row. We're nearing the end of that 33 days in a row because we posted so much over the past month. If you're new, you're probably going to want to catch up on a lot of the backlog, which you can find on this channel by hitting the subscribe button. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.